January 1942. A cold wind crawls across the English countryside, flattening the grass outside a nondescript wooden hut near the Suffolk coast. Inside, the lights are dim, the air thick with the hum of makeshift equipment, old radio chassis, copper wire, and the faint smell of solder. 3 men sit in silence, headphones pressed tight against their ears. On the table, a tangled cluster of scrap parts rattles faintly, a radio that looks more like a heap from the local junkyard than a weapon of war. Then, through the static, it happens. A low, rhythmic growl, metallic, steady, distant. One man leans forward, his breath held. The sound repeats, then grows louder. Miles away, hidden beyond the rolling hills, a column of German tanks rumbles toward the coast. But here, in this forgotten shack, they've already been heard. No radar, no aircraft, just sound. The man removes his headset, eyes wide. He knows what it means. They've done it. They can hear the enemy coming, long before anyone else. And it all began with what soldiers soon called the Junkyard radio. By the winter of 1940, Europe was drowning in the thunder of treads. Across Poland, France, and the Low Countries, German panzer divisions had rewritten the language of modern warfare. In just months, armored columns cut through nations that had prepared for a static, World War I-style fight. The speed and coordination of Blitzkrieg shocked the world. Infantry, artillery, and air power moved as one, but it was the tank that became its steel spearhead. For the Allies, one truth became painfully clear. By the time you could see German armor, it was already too late. Radar, that glittering new marvel of British science, could track aircraft with precision, but it was nearly deaf to what moved on the ground. The Earth absorbed radar signals, trees, terrain, and even wet soil scrambled reflections. On the battlefield, soldiers and sentries relied on their eyes and ears, straining through night and fog to detect the first hints of movement. But against the relentless hum of engines, the clatter of logistics, and the chaos of artillery, human hearing wasn't enough. They needed machines that could listen better than men. In 1941, as Britain prepared for a possible German invasion, a small circle of engineers and scientists began studying the idea of acoustic detection, technology that could sense sound waves at long distances and translate them into location and movement. The concept wasn't new. Even before radar, armies had used massive concrete sound mirrors to detect incoming aircraft. But those hulking monoliths were static and fragile, useless for mobile warfare. Now, the problem was reversed. Instead of planes above, it was tanks below. Instead of loud engines in the sky, there were muffled vibrations across earth and air. How could anyone distinguish the unique acoustic signature of a panzer engine from that of a supply truck or a tractor? It was in this technological and psychological fog that one unassuming engineer, a man whose name rarely appeared in official histories, began experimenting with sound in ways few thought possible. He had worked on early radio sets for the Royal Air Force, scavenging broken parts during the Blitz to keep communication lines alive. But as the German war machine advanced, his focus shifted from transmitting signals to interpreting noise. He began to wonder, if a radio could receive waves from the sky, could it also pick up the faint electrical whispers made by machines on the ground? In a world where every resource was rationed, innovation was born not in laboratories, but in workshops and tool sheds. With spare resistors, salvaged headphones, and coils stripped from wrecked aircraft radios, the first crude prototypes emerged. They weren't elegant, far from it. The circuits buzzed, overheated, and sometimes caught fire. But occasionally, just occasionally, they produced something remarkable, a patterned rhythm buried in the static, faint but distinct, that didn't belong to nature. Those who heard it described it as a distant heartbeat made of steel. The discovery was small, almost accidental, but it opened a door. If tank engines created unique vibration frequencies as they moved and idled, then perhaps those patterns could be amplified and tracked. The idea spread quietly through research circles and field units. The War Office, cautious but intrigued, authorized limited testing along Britain's southeastern coast, where fears of German landings still loomed. Operators were trained to listen for repeating cycles, the low chug of Maybach engines that powered Panzer IIIs and IVs. With experience, they could even estimate distance and heading, much like submarine sonar operators judged depth. At first, most commanders dismissed it as a sideshow. The Junkyard radios, as troops nicknamed them, seemed too fragile, too eccentric to rely upon. But as the Battle of El Alamein approached, and as German armoured units pressed deeper into North Africa, the need for any early warning, no matter how unconventional, became urgent. In the lonely outposts of the desert and the misty fields of England, a new kind of soldier was listening, not for voices, but for machines. And what they began to hear would soon rewrite the way the Allies understood sound itself. These stories aren't just history, they're proof of human courage and sacrifice. If you too salute these heroes, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and become a part of our journey. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Let's continue the story. In the early months of 1942, Britain was still reeling from a year of loss and uncertainty. The Blitz had scarred its cities, the Atlantic convoys bled under U-boat assault, and in North Africa, Rommel's tanks seemed unstoppable. The war had become a contest not just of armies, but of minds. Inside a modest workshop tucked behind an RAF maintenance depot in Suffolk, a middle-aged engineer named Maurice Rawlings, formerly a civilian radio technician, found himself surrounded by piles of twisted copper, shattered vacuum tubes, and dented radio housings scavenged from downed aircraft. It was a strange kind of laboratory, part scrapyard, part sanctuary. Every wire, bolt, and condenser had been salvaged from wreckage. War rationing had stripped the country of luxuries, even in research. If something was needed, it had to be found, repaired, or imagined. Rawlings had no formal laboratory funding, no team of assistants, and little patience for bureaucracy. What he did have was curiosity, and the quiet backing of an RAF signals officer who believed that unconventional thinking might win unconventional wars. His obsession began with a rumor that Polish intelligence units had once tried using modified microphones to track tank columns by their vibration signatures during the 1939 campaign. The idea never matured, but the seed was enough. Rawlings began experimenting. He assembled a network of microphones from damaged field radios, linked through a crude amplifier built from scavenged components. It looked nothing like military equipment, more like the contents of a child's science fair project gone mad. But when he connected the system to a set of old RAF listening posts along the coast, the results startled even him. Through the hiss and pop of interference came patterns, low-frequency pulses that shifted as engines started and stopped, echoing faintly through the damp English soil. Each engine produced a distinct fingerprint. To refine his system, Rawlings borrowed from music. He knew that harmonics and overtones shaped every sound, whether it was a violin string or a tank engine. By adjusting his circuitry to emphasize certain frequency bands, the growl of diesel engines, the hum of armored tracks, he could filter out background noise. What remained was something eerie and unmistakable, the living pulse of machinery miles away. At first, the RAF dismissed his reports as coincidence. Too many variables, they said. Too much noise, too little proof. But a demonstration changed everything. On a foggy March morning, Rawlings set up his Junkyard radio near an RAF training ground. Several miles away, a group of Churchill tanks began maneuvering for exercises. Rawlings turned the dials. In the crackle of his homemade set, rhythmic thumps appeared, slow, steady, unmistakable. When plotted against time, they matched perfectly with the tank's movements. For the first time, British intelligence could hear armour in motion, and not just local noise, but real, measurable signals that could be triangulated. Word spread quietly through the War Office and to the newly formed Scientific Intelligence Division. To them, this was more than an oddity. It was a potential answer to one of the war's most elusive problems, predicting German armored assaults before they struck. Within months, Rawlings's crude prototypes were being replicated in small batches and shipped to field units. They were never standardized, never mass-produced. Each looked slightly different, shaped by whatever parts could be found, but all shared the same heart, a network of coils, amplifiers, and filters that turned chaos into clarity. Soldiers gave them nicknames: the Junkyard Ear, the Scrapbox Set, or simply the Junkyard Radio. The name stuck, half in jest, half in awe. By late 1942, acoustic detection units were being quietly tested in North Africa, wired into forward observation posts. Operators learned to distinguish between friendly engines and enemy ones by sound alone, a subtle art that combined technology with human intuition. The results were uneven, but undeniable. Some nights, the devices failed entirely. Other nights, they gave hours of warning, enough for British anti-tank crews to dig in, reposition, or call for air support. It wasn't perfection. It was possibility. And in a war where every second counted, that was enough. The Junkyard Radio didn't just capture sound. It captured something else, the essence of wartime invention, where brilliance often came wrapped in dust, wire, and stubborn hope. In the months ahead, as Allied command took notice and scientists began refining the principle of acoustic detection, the project would evolve beyond Rawlings's small hut. What began as a desperate improvisation would soon merge with radar, signal analysis, and mathematics, becoming a quiet revolution in how wars were fought and heard. And for the first time in history, sound itself would become a weapon. The human angle, the listeners in the dark. They called them the listeners. They were not frontline soldiers or decorated aces. Most were radio operators, engineers, or mechanics, men who spent their nights surrounded by cables and static, not by gunfire. Yet their work carried a strange intimacy with the enemy. In the dim glow of field lamps, these operators sat in silence, headphones pressed tight, their faces pale and still. For hours they heard nothing but the hiss of air and the faint pulse of the earth. Then, when a rhythmic pattern emerged, the slow, mechanical thump of a Maybach engine or the grumble of tracks over rock, their bodies tensed like hunters catching scent. They were listening for death. Each man developed his own intuition. Some claimed they could tell a Panzer III from a Tiger simply by its tone, a lower growl, a more uneven idle. Others learned to differentiate distance by delay, like sonar men judging echoes in the deep. It was as much art as science. Fatigue blurred the senses. Static played tricks on the mind. In the field reports from Tunisia, one operator described phantom tanks, signals that rose and vanished without explanation. Later, engineers realized they were reflections, sound waves bouncing off distant terrain. But in the moment, alone with the headphones, it was like hearing ghosts. The job required absolute focus and almost no recognition. There were no medals for those who listened. Only the quiet knowledge that somewhere out in the desert or the fields of France, lives depended on what they heard or didn't. For some, that burden became heavy. After weeks of listening, operators described hearing tank engines even in their sleep. The rhythm of war had entered their minds. But for all their exhaustion, there was pride. Their scrap-built devices, scorned by many, had begun to save lives. Early warning reports were reaching commanders, convoys were rerouted, ambushes were avoided. And though their names never reached the newspapers, they had joined a lineage of invisible warriors, those who fought not with rifles or planes, but with patience, wire, and ears attuned to steel. In a war defined by sight, by bombers overhead, by tanks in daylight charge, they fought through sound. The technological angle, the science of sound detection. The junkyard radio operated on a principle older than electronics. That sound, if captured and interpreted, carries the truth of movement. In essence, the device was a hybrid, part radio receiver, part seismic sensor. Microphones or ground contacts picked up low-frequency vibrations created by tank engines and tracks. These were amplified through circuits tuned to enhance specific frequency bands between 10 and 300 Hz, the same range that heavy machinery produced when moving across soil. Unlike radar, which sent out signals and measured what bounced back, the junkyard radio was passive. It listened. It emitted nothing, revealing nothing of its own position. In a war of constant surveillance, silence was power. The early sets were crude. Vacuum tubes from civilian radios were adapted for field use. Transformers were rewound by hand. Amplifiers overheated in the desert sun. The entire unit might weigh less than a field telephone, yet it could detect armored movement several miles away under the right conditions. Operators placed multiple receivers in a rough triangle or line. When a sound was detected, its arrival time at each post was logged. By comparing delays, they could estimate the direction and sometimes the distance of the source. It was, in miniature, an acoustic form of triangulation later used in sonar and artillery sound ranging. But unlike artillery, where explosions were sudden and loud, tank engines were continuous and subtle. To isolate them, engineers learned to use filters, coils and capacitors arranged to suppress high frequencies. What remained was the deep mechanical hum that distinguished steel from silence. The challenge lay in interpretation. A convoy of trucks could mimic the same frequency range as light tanks. Wind, rain, or even distant artillery could distort readings. The human ear, trained and disciplined, remained the most effective processor. In that sense, the junkyard radio was as much a test of men as of machines. Later refinements introduced oscillograph displays, visual traces of the sound waves that allowed trained analysts to identify signatures more precisely. By 1943, these acoustic traces were being cross-referenced with captured German engines. Each tank model had a distinct pattern: the Tiger's double Maybach engines, the Panzer IV's steady rhythm, the half-track's lighter staccato. This method of classification, primitive by modern standards, laid the foundation for later acoustic intelligence. It proved that even in the absence of sight, the enemy could be known, measured, and predicted. The junkyard radio thus bridged two worlds: the dying age of mechanical warfare and the dawn of electronic intelligence. And somewhere between those worlds stood men like Maurice Rawlings, improvisers, soldering wire with frozen hands, building machines out of wreckage that could hear the future coming before anyone else. Their invention was not polished, not perfect, but it worked. And in the war's darkest nights, that was enough. The sound of German tanks had been transformed, from terror in the dark to a signal of opportunity. And as the system spread to the field, another question began to emerge. Could this strange, improvised ear change the tide of battle itself? The tactical angle, hearing the battlefield. In war, information is power, and in 1942, information often arrived too late. Convoys were ambushed. Armored divisions struck without warning. Dust clouds on the horizon or the rumble of engines were the only clues. But the junkyard radio changed that equation. Deployed along desert ridges and forward lines, the system gave commanders something priceless: time. Minutes, sometimes hours, of warning could mean the difference between survival and destruction. A single report of approaching armor allowed artillery crews to calibrate range, anti-tank guns to reposition, and air reconnaissance to be redirected before the first shot was fired. In North Africa, this advantage became decisive. Reports from British 8th Army units near El Alamein described how sound monitoring posts detected Axis movement well before contact. The deep frequency hum of German panzers moving at night, faint but steady, gave Allied units enough warning to lay ambushes or shift reserves. The system's greatest strength was its simplicity. No transmission, no power-hungry radar arrays, just listening posts wired to a command tent. Portable, cheap, and invisible. At its peak, some operators could even interpret the mood of an advancing formation. The staggered rhythm of tanks struggling through sand, the tight pulse of engines moving in formation, or the broken pattern of retreat. Sound became intelligence. It also changed the way commanders thought about space. The battlefield was no longer flat terrain dotted with observation posts. It became an acoustic landscape. Hills, valleys, and roads became amplifiers or dampeners, shaping the flow of war through invisible waves. One officer described it simply, "For the first time, we could feel the battlefield moving, not see it, but feel it." The Junkyard radio was not decisive on its own. It didn't win battles or destroy tanks. But it fed a growing web of intelligence, the fusion of human observation, radar, radio intercepts, and now, sound. Together, these formed the backbone of what would later be called Allied battlefield awareness. It was a glimpse into the future, a world where every vibration, every noise, could be measured, mapped, and used. The enemy angle, countermeasures, and the fog of sound. The Germans, for their part, were not deaf to this new form of warfare. Captured reports and debriefings after 1943 show that Wehrmacht intelligence had become aware of Allied listening posts. They initially assumed these were radar-based or seismic detection systems. Soon, they began experimenting with their own acoustic camouflage. Crews were instructed to idle engines less frequently at night, to stagger movement to confuse detection, and to employ deception convoys with trucks towing empty trailers to simulate tank columns. The Afrika Korps, in particular, became adept at manipulating the desert soundscape. Sand absorbed vibrations unpredictably, allowing German forces to mask their movements during sandstorms or along rocky wadis. Yet even their best efforts could not fully silence the truth of machinery. The deep mechanical resonance of armor, that unique, unbroken hum, could not be hidden for long. Some German engineers considered developing sound-dampening skirts or modified exhaust systems. But such measures added weight and reduced efficiency, luxuries the panzer divisions could not afford. In a sense, the Junkyard radio forced both sides into an invisible duel, a contest of silence and detection. One side listening, the other trying not to be heard. The Germans' main advantage remained speed and initiative. By the time Allied operators confirmed a sound contact, the panzers might already have changed course. But even this cat-and-mouse struggle changed tactics. Armored thrusts slowed, regroupings became cautious, and commanders hesitated to move en masse under the cover of night. Sound, once a passive byproduct of war, had become a strategic liability. And in a conflict where every innovation triggered a countermeasure, this new frontier of acoustic intelligence forced the enemy to think and move differently. The moral angle, the intimacy of listening. War is full of distance. Pilots see explosions from miles above. Artillery officers never see the faces their shells find. But the men who operated the Junkyard radio experienced war in a different register, through sound. They didn't just detect the enemy. They heard them live. In the headphones, a tank column wasn't an abstract force. It was breath, motion, fatigue, the rhythmic panting of engines, the subtle changes when crews halted to rest or restart. Some operators reported hearing voices faintly carried by wind across microphones, German mechanics shouting commands, metal doors slamming. It was as though the enemy's heartbeat reached them through the ground. For those who listened long enough, that intimacy became haunting. Every approaching engine meant death on both sides, death delayed or redirected, but never avoided. There was no glory in it. No victory to witness. Just patterns, frequencies, and the knowledge that each detection meant men, unseen, unknown, were about to die. After the war, a few surviving operators recalled their unease. "You began to know them by sound," one said in an oral history recorded in 1971. "The way some engines misfired, or one that always lagged behind. You could tell when they were tired, when they were desperate." It was a strange empathy born from the mechanics of war. To know the enemy not by face or uniform, but by the rhythm of his machine, a rhythm that stopped only when his machine did. In the age of total war, where technology multiplied destruction, the junkyard radio revealed something paradoxical. The closer humans came to mastering sound, the more they were forced to listen to what war truly was. And as the Allies began to use the device in active campaigns, this eerie connection between sound and survival reached its breaking point, leading to the moment when the junkyard radio would prove its worth beyond all doubt. June 1942. The desert around El Alamein was a furnace by day and a void by night. The sand swallowed light, and the horizon, empty and merciless, offered no warning of what moved across it. For weeks, British forces had been retreating westward, battered by Rommel's relentless drive. The Afrika Korps, lean and fast, had mastered the art of surprise. Tanks struck from the darkness, hitting supply lines before defenders even knew they were near. In a small forward observation post dug into a ridge near the Katara Depression, a handful of men from the Royal Corps of Signals crouched over their latest experiment, a battered metal box wired to a network of buried microphones. It was one of Maurice Rawlings's prototypes, flown out from England under secrecy. The soldiers joked about it. The scrap-box oracle, one called it. But that night, as the wind fell still and the temperature dropped, the joke stopped. For hours, they heard nothing. Just static. The faint hiss of desert air. The glow from their signal lamp barely reached the sand outside. Then, just after midnight, a sound appeared. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but regular. A dull, rhythmic pulse, low and heavy. The operator leaned in, adjusting the gain. The sound deepened, its tempo steady. He recognized it instantly. A Maybach HL-120 engine. German armor. He checked the direction. Southwest. The vibrations came in a slow wave, growing stronger. More engines joined, merging into a deep mechanical choir. He began logging timestamps, comparing with the second listening post half a mile away. The delay between signals confirmed distance, roughly 10 miles and closing. He radioed the coordinates to brigade headquarters. No scouts had reported movement. No aircraft had seen anything. Yet within minutes, British artillery units began shifting positions, preparing an ambush line behind the ridges. As the night deepened, the operators listened. The sounds thickened, layered. You could almost feel the movement, a convoy of engines crawling through the dark. By 0200 hours, the first flashes appeared on the horizon, German tanks moving cautiously, unaware they had been detected hours before. When they crested the ridge, they met a wall of fire. Artillery batteries unleashed pre-sighted volleys. Anti-tank crews opened from concealed trenches. Within minutes, the lead German vehicles erupted in flame. Confusion rippled through the Axis formation. What had seemed an unguarded flank had become a trap. From the listening post, the men could hear it, the change in rhythm. Engines stalling, tracks grinding, transmissions howling in reverse. They were hearing a retreat in real time. Later reports described the engagement as a minor skirmish, barely noted in official histories. But within the Signal Corps, it was remembered as something else entirely, the first confirmed victory guided by sound alone. The junkyard radio had done what radar could not. It had heard the invisible. Over the following nights, similar experiments continued. Operators refined their methods, adjusting microphone spacing, testing new amplifiers. They discovered that even when tanks stopped moving, the The faint electrical noise of their idling engines could still be picked up. The desert became an echo chamber, a living map of vibrations. Soon, the devices were linked to artillery coordination posts. When operators detected movement, coordinates were triangulated and passed instantly to gun batteries. The response time shrank from hours to minutes. Each success reinforced belief. Commanders who once dismissed the system now demanded it. Reports traveled back to London and Cairo. Scientists were summoned to refine the principle, to make it portable, scalable. Maurice Rawlings, still working from his coastal workshop, received a telegram that simply read, "Your set heard the enemy first. Continue development. GCI." He framed it above his workbench. The Junkyard radio was no longer a curiosity. It was a weapon, invisible, improvised, and alive. For the men in the field, it became a quiet companion. Before every battle, they calibrated the dials, buried the microphones, and waited. The desert had a rhythm now, and they had learned to read it. At El Alamein, sound became strategy. And as the war turned toward the decisive autumn offensive, the Allies' new ability to anticipate movement, to hear Rommel's forces before they struck, would tip the balance once more. But the greatest test was still to come, when the listening posts would face not the vastness of the desert, but the chaos of Europe itself, where every sound was drowned by the storm of total war. By mid-1943, the tide of war was turning. The victories at El Alamein and Stalingrad had broken the illusion of German invincibility. Yet across the Atlantic and in the planning rooms of London, another campaign was already being drawn, the coming storm in Western Europe. Operation Overlord would require the largest amphibious invasion in history. But before that day could come, the Allies needed to read the movement of German armor across occupied France, divisions that could reinforce the beaches or crush any landing before it gained a foothold. Traditional reconnaissance had limits. Aircraft could be shot down. Spies could be captured. Radio intercepts offered clues, but not positions. What was needed was something quieter, something the enemy could neither jam nor detect. Sound, once again, offered an answer. By late 1943, Rawlings's crude device had evolved. British and American engineers, working under the Combined Research Group for Acoustic Detection, built compact field units based on his original design. Instead of scrap coils, they now used refined amplifiers and magnetic pickups buried in shallow trenches. The Junkyard radio had become the Mark III acoustic locator. It was still simple, a metal box, a dial, and a pair of headphones, but its principle remained pure: listen, record, triangulate. The first major deployment came not in Normandy, but in Italy. As Allied forces advanced north after the fall of Naples, acoustic teams were attached to artillery regiments and reconnaissance companies. Their mission: detect and locate German armor movements through mountainous terrain where radar was useless. The results astonished commanders. In one documented case during the Battle of Monte Cassino, a British acoustic team detected armored movement nearly 12 kilometers away, tanks attempting to reposition under cover of night. The coordinates were relayed to artillery batteries, which opened fire minutes later. Reconnaissance confirmed multiple enemy vehicles destroyed. Sound had outpaced sight once more. As the Allies prepared for D-Day, these experiments became doctrine. Small sound intelligence detachments were embedded with invasion forces. Their task was not glamorous, but vital: set up listening stations along the beachhead perimeter and warn of any approaching German armor before radar or scouts could see it. On June 7, 1944, the day after the landings, one such team near Gold Beach recorded the faint, steady hum of engines inland. The signal was weak but distinct. Analysis identified the acoustic signature of Panzer IVs moving east toward Bayeux. The warning allowed Allied units to reposition anti-tank defenses hours before contact. When the German counterattack came, the Allied line held. No one on the battlefield knew that a few men with headphones had been their first shield. By late 1944, acoustic intelligence had matured into a formal discipline. American Signal Corps and British Royal Engineers collaborated to map engine frequencies of every known Axis vehicle. Operators carried laminated charts showing harmonic patterns, the sound fingerprints of each tank type. For the first time, war had become a symphony of identifiable tones. Yet even as the science advanced, the essence remained personal: a man, a wire, a pair of ears, and the faint murmur of machines in the distance. Many of the best operators had no formal training. They came from civilian trades, mechanics, musicians, radio hobbyists, men whose instincts bridged art and engineering. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes that winter, during the Battle of the Bulge, those instincts were tested like never before. German armor moved through snow and silence, invisible to reconnaissance aircraft grounded by weather. The air was thick, muffled, deceptive, but sound still traveled through the earth. In late December, an American sound team picked up low, irregular pulses coming from the east, the unmistakable double beat of Koenigsegger engines. The warning reached headquarters in time for artillery batteries to target the assembly area before dawn. It didn't stop the offensive, but it blunted its edge. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the Junkyard radio had become a quiet legend, never publicized, never glorified, but whispered about among engineers and gunners alike. Maurice Rawlings received no medal, no formal recognition. He continued his work anonymously, refining his devices for the remainder of the war. But among the small fraternity of signals men who had used them, his name carried quiet reverence. One of them later wrote in a post-war letter, "We fought by listening, and the man who gave us the ears to hear did more than most who carried a gun." In the grand chronicles of World War II, the Junkyard radio was a footnote, overshadowed by radar, code-breaking, and atomic science. Yet in those hidden moments between silence and chaos, when the night was still and the future approached on treads, it was sound that told the truth first. And in that truth lay the seed of every surveillance system, every sonar net, every acoustic array that would follow in the decades to come. The battle for Europe had been fought with sight and steel, but also with the quiet art of hearing. And when the guns finally fell silent, the echoes remained, proof that even in the noise of war, a single act of human ingenuity could still find meaning in the smallest vibration. By the spring of 1945, Europe was a continent of ruins, cities flattened, armies exhausted, silence replacing thunder. Yet for the Allied signal and engineering units, the end of war was not an end to listening. It was a beginning. The acoustic posts, scattered from Normandy to the Rhine, were dismantled and studied. The reports they had generated, once stamped top secret, were gathered into archives marked experimental field detection systems. Inside those dusty files lay a quiet revolution in warfare, proof that the battlefield could be heard as well as seen. Intelligence officers reviewing those logs found something remarkable. In several operations between late 1943 and 1945, units equipped with Junkyard radios or their derivatives had consistently provided earlier warnings of enemy armor than patrols or aerial reconnaissance. The margin was often small, 30 minutes here, an hour there, but in war, minutes could rewrite history. A report issued by the British War Office in August 1945 noted, "Field experiments with improvised acoustic amplification units have demonstrated the operational value of passive sound detection in mobile warfare. Further study is recommended for future mechanized conflicts." In the shadow of the atomic age, those words seemed almost quaint. Yet they reflected a deeper truth, that war was no longer about seeing the enemy, but sensing him. Maurice Rawlings, now back in civilian life, returned to his modest home workshop in Suffolk. He had been offered a position at a government research facility in Malvern but declined, preferring the solitude of tinkering. In private correspondence with a fellow engineer, he described the end of his war as a return to silence, the first real silence in years. Still, his work continued to ripple outward. The concept of acoustic triangulation inspired new fields: submarine detection, battlefield surveillance, and later, anti-submarine warfare systems that would dominate the Cold War. The U.S. Navy's early experiments with passive sonar arrays drew directly from wartime acoustic detection research, some of which traced back to Rawlings's improvised circuits. In Britain, scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, took note of how low-frequency sound traveled differently through earth, air, and metal. This led to the first systematic studies of infrasound, vibrations below the range of human hearing, a field that would one day help detect earthquakes, underground tests, and even missile launches. The Junkyard radio, once a tool of desperation, had quietly opened a door to an entire new science of listening. For those who had operated the devices, the post-war years were quieter but not easier. Some joined post-war research programs, others returned to civilian trades. A few, interviewed decades later, spoke of an odd dissonance, the adjustment from nights of tension to ordinary silence. One veteran recalled sitting in his garden years later and hearing the distant rumble of farm machinery. For a moment, he said, it was like being back in the headphones again. They had spent the war hearing what others could not, the invisible prelude to violence. And though peace had returned, the habit of listening never left them. In the archives, the original field reports still bore their curious headings: sound anomaly detected, engine resonance logged, vibration source confirmed. These cryptic phrases told the story of men who had turned noise into foresight. By the time radar and sonar became dominant, the name Junkyard radio had faded from official memory. But in military laboratories, the same logic persisted, that even the smallest vibration, properly interpreted, could reveal the truth. The war had taught scientists that information was not limited to sight. It existed in air, in ground, in sound. And in that lesson lay the blueprint for the sensory intelligence networks that would define every conflict to come. The Junkyard radio had begun as an accident of necessity, a desperate machine built from scraps. But its echoes were still spreading, shaping the modern art of listening to the world. In the years that followed World War II, the world learned to listen in new ways. The Cold War was not fought with the thunder of tank columns, but with invisible signals and silent sensors. What began in the huts of Suffolk and the sands of North Africa evolved into a global web of acoustic surveillance, from the depths of the Atlantic to the frozen expanse of the Arctic. In 1954, the United States Navy unveiled the Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS, a vast network of undersea hydrophones designed to detect the faint rumble of Soviet submarines thousands of miles away. Its engineers, many of them veterans of wartime sound projects, credited early field experiments with proving the potential of low-frequency listening. British scientists followed with their own acoustic defense systems, developing ground microphones capable of detecting vehicles or tunneling beneath air bases, technologies that would be refined during the tensions of Berlin and later during NATO's defense modernization. Though the devices were sophisticated, the underlying concept was timeless. The Earth itself was a sensor, and every machine left a signature in its wake. Maurice Rawlings's Junkyard radio had shown that even with crude materials and simple circuits, the truth could be heard if one learned how to listen. Rawlings himself lived a modest, unheralded life. In the late 1940s, he lectured occasionally on sound propagation and worked as a consultant for agricultural radio systems, never seeking attention, never claiming his wartime contribution. His name appeared briefly in a post-war patent index for a directional acoustic amplifier, filed quietly in 1950 and forgotten just as quickly. By the time he passed away in the early 1960s, few outside his circle remembered what he had built. The world had moved on to jets, rockets, and atomic power. The idea that a handful of engineers once hunted tanks by sound seemed almost quaint, a relic from another age. And yet, his work endured, hidden within the fabric of modern surveillance. The same principles used to detect tanks in 1942 would one day be used to identify drones, monitor earthquakes, and analyze the movement of glacier. Acoustic arrays deployed in Afghanistan in the early 2000s, capable of pinpointing sniper fire within seconds, were direct descendants of those first analog circuits. Even in space exploration, the method persisted. In 1969, when engineers at NASA designed the seismometers for the Apollo lunar missions, they borrowed mathematical models of vibration mapping developed from mid-century acoustic defense studies, descendants, in part, of that junkyard radio. History had a way of forgetting the small origins of great ideas. In military museums across Britain and the US, radar consoles and Enigma machines stand behind glass, celebrated, documented, immortalized. But nowhere, in any hall of fame or archive, is there a mention of the crude, solder-scorched device that once sat on a wooden table and listened for German tanks in the dark. Yet its absence is fitting. The junkyard radio was never about glory. It was about necessity, about the human instinct to adapt, to make sense of chaos using whatever tools were at hand. In a world torn apart by machinery, it found salvation in the simple act of hearing. As the 20th century marched forward, sound became data, and data became power. Nations learned to map the invisible, the movements of oceans, the tremors of underground tests, the pulse of the planet itself. And though few knew his name, the quiet man from Suffolk had helped teach the world that every movement, every machine, every threat made a sound waiting to be found. For historians who later stumbled upon his story, the legacy of Rawlings was more than technological. It was philosophical. It showed that progress does not always roar with engines or shine with light. Sometimes it hums faintly in the static, a whisper beneath the noise. And in that whisper, one can still hear the beginning of an age defined not by how far we can see, but by how deeply we can listen. The echoes of that idea carried into the modern world, shaping how we defend, explore, and understand everything around us. The war had ended. The world had changed. But the sound never stopped. War is often measured in the visible, the front lines, the explosions, the columns of steel and fire. Yet sometimes, the most profound battles are fought in silence. The junkyard radio reminds us of this, that ingenuity can flourish not in laboratories or factories, but in the quiet spaces between desperation and possibility. Maurice Rawlings and the small circle of engineers who built those devices never held rifles on the battlefield. They never drove tanks into sand or mud. But in a strange, intimate way, they were there. They were in the pause before an ambush, in the faint vibration beneath the earth, in the moment when human attention and mechanical noise collided to create foresight. Their work transformed the invisible into the actionable. It blurred the line between man and machine, teaching soldiers to listen as carefully as they aimed. And in doing so, it created a new kind of awareness, one that recognized that every engine, every machine, every heartbeat leaves a trace waiting to be understood. In the decades since, the echoes of that invention have shaped the modern world. From sonar and seismic arrays to drone detection and planetary exploration, the same principle persists. Understanding begins with observation, and sometimes the quietest signals carry the greatest truth. Yet perhaps the most enduring lesson is human. The war demanded creativity born of scarcity, of improvisation, of persistence. A simple device made of scrap metal and wire changed the way armies moved, how commanders planned, and how soldiers survived. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, ingenuity can turn fear into knowledge, and knowledge into life. The junkyard radio was more than a machine. It was a testament to listening, to patience, to perception, and to the invisible threads that connect human action to consequence. And in that quiet act, the story of war becomes not just one of destruction, but one of insight, of human resilience, and of the profound power hidden in the hum of a machine. The world may never hear it again. But once, In the deserts of North Africa and the fields of Europe, it spoke, and those who listened changed the course of history.